Hi there, Liron here, and today we're talking about handling paint in the palette. What's up, Liron here. Thank you for joining me in another video. And today I have a very basic beginner's topic for you. I've been asked to make a video about this one for a while now, and that is how to handle paint on the palette. It's going to be a very basic beginner's tutorial on dipping the brush into water, using it to reactivate the paint, using it for the different wells, different types of brushes, being smart about it and making a separation between warms and cools and all sorts of, I think, interesting topics. Now, as I'm working inside my own mind about bringing back that information, because it's very basic and it's things I do intuitively, I can remember some things that were sticking points for me, some things that were challenging, but I'm sure I missed plenty. So if there's anything in particular that you want me to talk more of, dive deeper on, cover more, let me know and I'll try and do that. If it's something quick and short, I can even do it on Instagram and show you, with a quick video or IGTV. And if it's something longer, I'll be happy to make a video about it. So if during this video you have some questions that are popping, let me know in a comment below and I'll be happy to cover it. But for now, let's dive into the tutorial and I'm going to teach you how to handle paint on the palette. Very basic. Maybe you'll get a few insights if you're already intermediate. I hope it's going to help you. Let's get started. Okay, so let's get started, and I've got two angles here because I want to grab as much footage as possible. I want you to see my palette here, so I'm recording this with my iPhone right here, and then I have the upper camera to show you the paper as well. So because this is a bit of a complex topic on the other hand, yet very basic, and I'm trying really to dig into myself and find the basics that I want to teach you, because the more you progress, the harder it is to put into words sometimes these concepts. So I have a few notes for myself about different topics I want to discuss as I demo this. Okay, so the first thing is, and I'm using a smaller water cup so you can see this, the first thing to understand is the paint on the palette, and this is really again for super beginners. The paint on the palette is dry, okay? So if I were to use a dry brush and try to pick it up, I'm going to dry it out completely, and I'm going to try and pick it up. You see, nothing happens really. I can't pick it off the palette. I need to wet the brush first, okay? So I'm putting it in the water cup, coming back into the palette, and now you see how slowly the paint reawakens, okay? And then I can use it, like so, okay? So that's one thing. The first, let's say, most basic thing is you wet the brush, okay? Now, the more water you're gonna add here, the more watered down the wash is going to become. Now, this is important to talk about because let's say right now I want to produce a dark value, meaning I want and I'm gonna add the towel here. Let's say I want to produce a dark value. Then if I come into the brush with too much water, I'm gonna lose any chance of producing a dark value. Okay, and this is something that beginners have a lot of trouble with. So let me show you what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna wipe the brush over my super dirty towel and come back with just a little bit of a damp brush, and then I can produce a bit of a darker value, okay? Now, of course, it has to do with the amount of paint you have here, and so now we have a lot of water and less paint. So what I'm gonna do, and I'm going to show you exactly how I do it, I'm gonna use all of the paint in this part of the palette, okay, and show you how I produce a dark value with it. So first, let's say I wet the brush, but I don't want it to be too wet, so I'm gonna wipe most of it. Here I have a piece of paper as well. I'm gonna come back with a damp brush, okay, and you can probably see how it's damp, but it's not dripping wet. It's not even close to being dripping wet. And then I'm gonna pick up all of the paint, maybe touch a bit of the water here just to get things to move around a bit. But because I came with little water, you see how I am able to produce a darker value here. Okay, this is really important. And if I want to get it darker, I'm gonna continue digging through the dry paint, okay, and produce a darker and darker value. But if I come back with a wet brush, just stick it in here, I have no shot. Look, I'm going to collect all of the paint here and I have no shot of producing a dark value. Okay, so that's the gist of it. Now, so far we've been talking about the paint that was already here in this area and we just re-wet it like I'm showing you right here. So you can decide on how much water you want to add in order to water it down. I can come back with even more water and make it even more watered down, okay? But let's talk a bit about the wells, okay? And I'm gonna zoom in a bit, or maybe I'll keep it at this distance maybe, and I can zoom in later on when editing the video. So when you want to reactivate the paint in the wells, the same thing happens really. You have to come into the well with a bit of a wet or damp brush. Now sometimes what helps is to spray some water, and let me bring my spray bottle. Okay, so I got my spray bottle here. What I do to get started is I'll spray some water over all of the wells, and I find that this really helps to reactivate the paint, okay? And then I can come back, and I also brought some toilet paper so that I can clean up some parts of the wells later on, of the pools here. What I do now is come back with a damp brush, and this is enough to reawaken the paint. Okay, now what you want to do is make sure you don't come back with like a dripping wet brush, because what happens is the paint is going to pool. You see that there's a huge pool here created. Sometimes you don't want that to happen. So what I usually do is I'll clean the brush a bit on the towel, then come back with a damp brush, and that way I can actually control the amount of wetness, let's say. Now, one important thing to remember, there are two ways basically to paint, and that is first you bring the paint from the well onto this area here, you mix a few paints up. So we're gonna create this turquoise maybe with the blue and the green. So you mix it here and then you use it here. Now another way, and this I do very often, is if I want to use pure paint, I'll just go into the well, bring it straight into the paper, okay? And that way I can preserve. And then I clean the brush, I'll wipe some of the paint off of it and go back to the other paint. And that way I can preserve the paint's individuality. So here it's mixed, but here you can see the individual paint. Okay, now really basic stuff, and a lot of it comes down to your personal taste in how you like to do things, okay? But again, important concepts. Now I'm gonna move this a bit so we can just have a better crop. So we talked about the water and paint relations. Okay, the more water I come in here with, the more it's gonna re-wet the wells, re-wet the paint already on the palette. Notice because I spritzed some water, I can come back and reactivate the paint very easily. Now I want to talk about types of brushes. Okay, now this brush I'm using here is rather soft. But when you're using, let's say this brush, this is a synthetic brush with a really good spring, so it's very strong. It's a Princeton size 12. And I love this brush for small details when I do larger paintings. With this brush, it's so strong because of its spring that you don't need to apply a lot of pressure to pick up the paint, okay? So I can pick it up very easily. Let me show you, for example, with this paint, the Carbazole Violet, that's almost dry. All I need, because it's such a powerful brush, really is a few strokes and I can grab a lot of the paint, okay? I can grab it here, bring it to the mixing area and mix it up. I find that when you just mix here and go into the paper and mix again here and go back to the paper and mix again here, you tend to get a very grayed out color scheme, okay? If you really want to preserve some purity of the paint, it's really good to go straight from the well and put it on paper, or you make the separation here. So I bring some of that violet, put it here where there's no other color, and then bring it onto the paper. Add a bit of water if I want to water it down, control the value, and then come back into the paper, but avoid mixing it with other paints to preserve its purity. So with that kind of brush, it's very easy to pick up the paint. In fact, if you're using a softer brush, it can hurt the bristles when you use too much force on the well, so you need to be really gentle. With this kind of brush, it can take much more of a beating, so you can really dig into the well, and it's easier to pick up the paint. It's also easier to kind of smush it against the paper like that, okay? And with these softer brushes, it's a bit of a different handling, let's say, way of handling. And here's another example of a brush. This brush can hold a lot of water in it. So one dip into the cup and I have to be really careful. Look how easily it reawakens all of the paints that I have here. Okay, so that's another thing you want to take into consideration. So this is really a softer brush, the Raphael size 12 as well. One of my favorites actually. Good for larger washes when you don't need too much control, because what happens is you can achieve a sharp tip with it, but not really sharp. You can see it's kind of rounded and it has a tip, but the tip isn't the cleanest. Now, when you work large, it's more, let's say, easier. Now, I want to show you Another example of something using this kind of brush, the rigger brush. This is the brush I use to sign my paintings. With this one, it's really hard to figure the water to paint ratio. What I usually do is I put a little bit of water in it and I come back to the paint like this, and I make sure I grab a lot of paint for every, let's say, water drop that I have here. So, and then you can sign and you can do whatever you want. You can do some dry brush. But you see, it's very hard to figure out the ratio. Now I'm almost running out of paint here, so I need to dip it again. And you need to remember not to use too much water, because if you use too much water with that type of a brush that doesn't have the ability to hold a lot of water to begin with, you may end up with a very runny paint. And if you're going to sign a painting, it's not going to be strong enough. So you want to grab mostly paint and just a little bit of water, you can see here, and then you can do your signature and whatever it is you do. You know, I just write down my name, not necessarily with red. I don't like to do it like everyone else does it, or a lot of other artists do it. Okay, so the type of brush, and I showed you 4 types here, has a strong influence on how you are gonna handle the paint on the palette. Now, one last note I want to add, and if there's anything else you want me to talk about, because this is basics, and honestly, for me, it's hard to remember what to talk about because it just comes intuitively. So let me know if you want me to discuss an element a little more, dive deeper in it. So now we're going to move on to the next and final element for this video, which is warm and cool colors. So what many people like to do, and I like to do that as well, is make a separation for warms and cools. So I may use this area here to mix my warms. So I'm going to pick up some of that red, and notice how I have a lot of water in this well. So what you do is, and here's a quick way to problem solve, you clean the brush, you wipe it on the towel almost completely, okay? You leave it just slightly damp, and then you come back and you suck up all the water out of the well, because it acts like a sponge, okay? Because we've emptied it of water. So that's a trick for you, because sometimes mid-painting your well is going to become full of water if you don't pay attention, and then it's a bit hard to control it. So you come back with a nearly dry brush and pick up the excess moist, okay? That's how you do it. Now, one more thing that I wanted to mention. Okay, so yeah, warm and cool. So what I like to do to make sure I don't get just boring rays, and if I want to control the temperature, is I'll dedicate one well, for example, this one, just warm mixes, okay? And then I can do this kind of thing, add maybe a bit of yellow here, put a bit of yellow, clean yellow maybe, and then the other well I'm gonna keep for cooler mixtures, okay? So then we get this kind of thing. Maybe we'll push it a bit with French ultramarine. You see what I mean? So in that way, you make sure that your colors aren't too grayed and browned out. So you get, or maybe grayed, let's say, because you have a cool and a warm pool. So what you want to do when you get a palette is make sure that it has enough mixing spaces. Well, this is why I love this Mijello 18 wells palette, because it has 2 large spaces and then a huge one. And then I can use each and every one of those for something else. Now, if you want to clean the palette, you just wet the area thoroughly, okay? That's what I find at least works for me. Then you come back with maybe a paper towel or something like this. Now, if you're using toilet paper like this one, it can leave debris in the thing, so you have to come just with one wipe, and that's it. You don't get a second wipe, maybe just on the other side. Otherwise, you're gonna leave some pieces of paper inside, and it's gonna be disgusting. Your brush will pick it up and it'll hurt your painting. Okay, so this is basically all I wanted to talk about. There's the paint and water ratio, how much water you bring into the palette. Then we have the wells and how you deal with them. Then we've got types of brushes that will influence how you work with the paint in the palette. And finally, we have the different pools of paint, okay? Now, one last note, if you're using a brush that has a huge and a large water capacity, and I'm gonna connect it to another tip, I recommend you mix more paint than you think you need, okay? And this is a good habit to have. Always try and mix a larger quantity than you think you'll need, because what happens is you almost are at risk of running out of paint. So you wanna make sure, especially with these thirsty brushes, that you have enough paint, because notice I'm just gonna apply some of it, and a bit more, and a bit more, and it's already getting dry. This area is already getting dry, and if I have to cover up a large space, I don't have much to work with, and I can feel it, okay? With time, you'll get an instinct for feeling how dry the brush is just by how the paint moves here in the palette, okay? Notice when I add water, you can feel that it has more movement to it. Okay, so that's one more thing to take into consideration. And this is basically it, very basic video. I hope this gave you maybe an insight that you needed regarding how to handle paint on the palette and how to work with it. I think there's a lot to discuss when it comes to this topic, but honestly, I may have forgotten some of it, so if there's anything you want me to talk more about, let me know in a comment below and I'll do my best to cover any topic that you raise up. And now we can wrap up this video. So this is it. I really hope you enjoyed this video and maybe you learned something new. Again, if you're an intermediate, then I don't know necessarily how much new information this kind of tutorial could provide for you, but even if you just get one insight or one refresher or one reminder, then I'm really happy. Let me know in a comment below what was the case for you and if that helped you in some way. I'll be really happy to know. And again, as I mentioned in the intro, if there's anything you want me to talk about in more depth, in more detail, let me know and I'll try and do that. I hope you like the two angles. I've been working hard on making sure that happens. So thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for your support in the last few videos. I really appreciate it, especially with the whole Patreon thing. I was blown away by the comments and I'm just so thankful to have an amazing following and audience of people like you, each and every one of you. So thank you so much and I will see you again in another vid real soon.